Refugees International says displaced girls and women are at greater risk of gender-based violence due to the COVID-19 pandemic. It's due to the effects of lockdown, border closures and heightened economic desperation. Many also face intimate partner violence, conflict-related sexual violence and human trafficking. The organization launched a report looking into the issue. We're joined by Devan Cone, who is the Refugees International's senior advocate for women and girls. Devan, it's a pleasure to have you with us tonight. Let's just take a look at the global picture, perhaps, of the issue of gender-based violence and where we are right now. Because often, when I take a look at a country like South Africa, the rate of gender-based violence is so high that we tend to think that it's limited to just who we are as a society. But in fact, some of the global figures are equally worrying.
Yes, thanks for having me, Kathy. Exactly what you said. It's not just South Africa. South Africa certainly has very high rates of gender-based violence, especially intimate partner violence. But this is really an issue for women and girls worldwide. Worldwide, 1 in 3 women and girls will face physical or sexual violence and abuse in their lifetime. So this is really an issue that is incredibly important and should not be overlooked, but certainly has gained worse in the COVID-19 crisis.
It's further exacerbated for women who've been displaced from their home. Does this matter whether it's internal displacement or whether people are actually having to flee their countries?
You know, we're seeing that with both internally displaced people and refugees and asylum seekers who have had to cross international borders. One of the differences with those who have crossed borders is that they aren't citizens in the country that they are hosted in, and so sometimes it can be very difficult to access legal recourse and really just get the, access the rights that they deserve, but also the services that they need.
So what is life like for those who have been displaced and they risk to exposure to violence?
You know, life can be very difficult, especially because many of them are in limbo. The family structures that they once had have broken down or have changed. And so, especially with intimate partner violence, we're seeing that while there's other risks like human trafficking and conflict-related sexual violence, intimate partner violence really in almost every case is almost every situation, it's the most prevalent form of violence against women and girls.
How has the lockdown changed that scenario, or should I say worsened that scenario?
Well, exactly as you said, it certainly has worsened the scenario for 2 reasons. One, because oftentimes with the quarantines and the lockdowns, women and girls are locked down and forced to quarantine with their abusers. And then secondly, with services and service providers and organizations like shelters and GBV service providers being shut down as well, accessing those services is very difficult. And also even reaching out to those services. If you're quarantined with your abuser, it can be very difficult to make phone calls or access the services and treatment that you need.
I'm curious to know whether there's a difference in the levels of violence against women in areas that are particularly undergoing some kind of whether internal conflicts, whether it's wars, political conflict, or if those numbers are the same across the board.
You know, that can be difficult to assess, particularly because, to be quite honest, in almost every case, it's underreported. So gender-based violence is underreported for a variety of reasons. So getting those accurate figures is difficult, but certainly it's really an issue across the board. I would say that in displacement or in situations and areas affected by war and conflict, oftentimes, again, there's a breakdown of social structures and institutions are not functioning as they would. So sometimes the violence is more in those situations.
How can governments be better responsive to the situation?
Well, first of all, in everything and all the programming and policies that governments enact, they need to take a gender analysis, meaning that with every policy, especially with COVID-19, that governments take on, they need to think about and determine how that will affect women and girls differently, what their needs are and what the additional risks are for women and girls as it relates to every policy decision. Also, there needs to be more funding for sexual and reproductive health services, for gender-based violence prevention services, and for maternal health care. I mean, there's a whole host of things that governments can do to improve the situation.
One of the recommendations that you also make is around community workers who you see as potentially being first aid providers, especially for women who are facing cases of gender-based violence.
Yes, indeed. And, you know, that's particularly important during COVID-19 when, again, services and shelters and other counseling services are not available or not able to access the women in need. But it's also important all the time. I mean, we find that community-based workers are often the first line of access for women who really need help, and they're often most trusted. So I think that it's really important to rely on people within the community to both identify these cases but also assist them.
What are the kind of responses that we're seeing from multiple governments where refugees and asylum seekers are concerned? Because right now, many governments seem to be consumed by dealing with the plight of their own citizens, trying to manage COVID-19. And I'm curious to know what that global picture looks like.
Well, unfortunately, what we're often seeing is increased xenophobia and nationalism and closing off of borders and, to be honest, more restrictions for refugees and asylum seekers than perhaps are necessary. So that's what we're often seeing. But also in a few countries, we're seeing that governments are allowing refugees and asylum seekers who have medical training to help in the response to COVID-19. And those are the examples that we think are best practices and we want to emulate.